All right, so we all know Dr. Tom Lippmann. He's here at CCOM, and his research areas of focus are shallow water physical oceanography, sediment transport, and bathymetric evolution. His current areas of interest include field observations, numerical modeling of shallow water marine processes, associated with inlets, estuaries, beaches, and coastlines, and assessing remote methods for sampling seafloor characteristics. So please welcome Dr. Lippmann.
Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some of you here in the audience, in particular those of you who collected data that I will be showing today, and those of you who have made presentations elsewhere that I'll hopefully give you credit for when I get to that point. So Salome, raise your hand when I get to that point. I'm going to present some of the work that she's been doing. Okay, so I have a lot of affiliations here. I have an office here in CCOM. I'm affiliated with the Earth Sciences Department. I'm the director of the Oceanography Graduate Program. I'm like director, not coordinator, director, right, Joel? And then I'm on various committees with the Ocean Engineering Graduate Program and Center for Ocean Engineering and the School of Marine Science. So a lot of things marine going on for me, mainly in shallow water. And today I just want to talk about what we've been doing and what we know about the Great Bay and why that's of interest to us and the importance of some of the things that we're doing and where we're headed with that. Okay, so we're motivated in a variety of ways. And I don't need to go through the details of why we'd be interested in estuarine physics or how the estuary evolves through time. Ecosystem health, navigation, ocean renewable energy, inundation, a lot of these things come into play. And we're funded to look at some of these things, and many of you probably as well have been funded to do that or are doing that now. Okay, so I want to get into immediately sort of the observations that we have made in the Great Bay, and then some of the modeling efforts that we've had to try to represent those observations and do some interesting things with that. So I'm going to talk about the bathymetry, specifically the part of the Great Bay that includes the Little Bay and the larger part of the Great Bay itself. So the Great Bay Estuary, as some of you may know, includes the Piscataqua River that enters the area here at Portsmouth Inlet. Okay, so the Piscataqua River and the Great Bay Estuary all are one big place. And sometimes people refer to this big, large area to the south of Jackson Lab as the Great Bay. And then the bigger area just to the north of Jackson Lab is the Little Bay, and I'll be referring to those similarly. But people talk about the Great Bay Estuary, it's the whole thing in general. But I'm going to talk about the bathymetry in this larger portion of the Great Bay up here. Then I want to talk about water levels in the Great Bay and the things that contribute to water levels, including tides and subtidal motions. Then we'll talk about current magnitudes and how currents evolve and change in the estuary. And finally, something about the sediments. And in particular, again, with the sediments, I'm going to be talking about the muds and the sands up in the Great Bay part of the estuary and our observations associated with those, including our efforts to use backscatter, in this case from single beam echo sounders, to try to characterize the seafloor. And finally, modeling efforts. This has mainly been done by Salome, my PhD student in oceanography. And up until this point, we really haven't had modeling capabilities for shallow water. We've always had to go off campus for that. So we're trying to generate those capabilities, and Salome's sort of leading that effort. And we're going to be using the coast modeling system to talk about tide, shear stresses, and how we would apply that to nutrient fluxes. Okay, so what I first want to do is just make some acknowledgments. And in particular, show you those acknowledgments as a function of the timeline here. I'm not going to go through all this in detail. A couple things I want to point out is that some of the people are here. Back in 2007, Carl Cameron was measuring currents in the Great Bay. Prior to that, the measurements were for 1975, also by NOAA. I don't think Carl was involved in that. But these were summarized by Rob Swift and Wendell Brunn, and I'm going to show some of the results that were compiled later by Jim Irish. I've outlined a few people here, Jim in particular, who's been involved in a number of these studies. As many of you know, Jim has made a career partly out of measuring currents in a variety of parts of the ocean, and he's been helping us tremendously. John Hunt has been a part of our lab since about 2009. So he's been a significant effort, or part of our efforts in the field aspects. And then we've got a lot of students who've been involved in thesis work and otherwise, and I wanted to just acknowledge their efforts. Okay. So let's get to the Great Bay. In 2009, Larry Ward, I believe was the initial person for this, came to Andy Armstrong and said, we need to know something about the bathymetry in the Great Bay. The previous surveys to that were 1953. single beam sonars that didn't have good vertical datum corrections. And prior to that was, I don't know, 50 years before that with lead line surveys. So we really didn't know, in general, what the bathymetry of the Great Bay was. At a general idea, we didn't really know, and also how it was changing in time. And so the Great Bay part of the estuary was surveyed with 3 vessels over the course of about 5 months. And all that data was integrated into one data set and became this new high-resolution data set for the Great Bay. It has 25-meter line spacings. We grid that to something like 10-meter grids, typically. In 2013, we were funded by the Department of Environmental Services to map the Little Bay. And so we added this to the survey itself. And we also did a bunch of things with backscatter from the Little Bay, which I'll talk about here in just a little bit. So in 2009, we measured the bathymetry. 2015, last year, Solomon goes, we need to measure currents, and so we can test the model that I'm developing. So with Jim's help, and Diane and some other people who have instruments, we put a bunch of ADCPs into the major part of the Great Bay, and I will show you some of these later. But in some of her evaluations of her models, she realized that the bathymetry may not be up to date. But we might be putting sensors in holes that didn't exist in 2009. So we needed an updated bathymetry if we were going to start comparing our observations that were made in 2015 with her model runs. So we went back in November last year, when we pulled the last instrument out and said we have to go back and measure the Great Bay. So John Hunt has been out surveying in the Great Bay for the last 3.5 months. And this has been a good time to be surveying. This is a good winter for it. It's a little bit warmer than normal. And he's just about done. But we are still doing a few more days. But I'm going to show you some results from the bathymetry that he's obtained so far. This is a map gridded to the same 10 by 10 meter resolution as the 2009 data. Keeping in mind that this is about a week old. So if there are errors here, we're going to fix those. And some of the data that we're going to filter out, there might be some noise that's coming through. But we can now subtract these 2 data sets from one another. This becomes now the change 2015 minus 2009. And this is red colors are accretion, that is sediment that has been added to those locations, and negative colors down to 1 meter depth are places where it is eroded. And if you get sort of into the greenish colors, that's essentially no change. If you integrate this whole picture, the net change is about 3 centimeters, which is below our resolution of our ability to measure the bottom. And so there's virtually no detectable change. We're unable to do that. There might be some hint that there's a little bit of sediment that's added to the fringes, but we're really not sure about that right now. It's too little change. If we integrate only the 2 meter and shallower region, it's the same thing, about 2 to 3 centimeters. So we're really not seeing a whole lot of net change. But that doesn't mean that there is an individual change in the estuary itself. And if you look closely, you can see that the changes tend to occur along the places where there are the channels and steep parts to the estuary itself. So we can look a little bit more closely at that. This is, if you look at this upper left-hand corner over here, we'll just blow that up. And I just took an example transect line. There's nothing special about this line. I just drew it. And then this is the same line for 2015. And then here's the change map. On the lower right-hand side is the elevation profile over that 2.5 to 2 3/4 kilometer length line. So that's 2.5 kilometers, more than 2.5 kilometers along this line, and about 10 meter resolution. We interpolate this to 1 meter just for the sake of smoothness. And what you can tell is that the green line, that's 2015, is significantly different in places than it was in 2009. In some places, the entire channel has been filled in. That's sort of at the edge of this little channel right here. That little hole has been filled in the meanwhile. So there are changes to the bathymetry that are relatively significant, and this would become important, for example, if you're doing any type of modeling exercises. Also, if you're doing any sediment transport kinds of things, would you be able to predict the qualitative behavior that's going on in the Great Bay? So these surveys from 2009 to 2015 show for the first time that there is significant changes that are going on in the Great Bay, not necessarily in a net change, but certainly in the position and location of the channels and how they're filling in and changing with mud and so forth.
It frustrates me that the definition, just in the images of the 2015 data set, is much higher than it was in the 2009. Is that real differences in the seafloor, measurement technique, data density?
I would suspect it has to do with the filtering operations that we're using on our original data. And the plan probably is to go back to the 2009 data and look at that again. This was done with 3 different sonars. I don't know how many people worked on 2 of them. I know who worked on 1 of them. And that was the data that's really smooth in there. That's the CBAS data. So there, we may go back and take a look at that. We can look at the change maps, and you can see places where there are some straight lines that clearly look like errors, which you didn't notice before in the 2009 data. So probably has to do with filtering and so forth and how we're dealing with that data. And we'll probably go back and reanalyze that data as well. This is not necessarily a fair comparison either. These are gridded to 10 meters. What we really want to do is look at the individual soundings and look at how close those soundings were to one another and then compare those individually. I haven't got to that point yet. We don't need to go to gridded data to intercompare the 2 surveys. We can look at the data of individual soundings when they were close to one another because we were using essentially the same track lines for the 2 surveys. We should have lots of data that's very close to one another. The other problem that we have, of course, is there's eelgrass in the Great Bay. Where's Ashley? Is she here? Okay. I don't know what's going on with eelgrass. We were in the winter. She said, oh, that's good because the eelgrass died back. I'm like, okay, that's good. But maybe in 2009 when we were there in the summer, there might have been a little bit more eelgrass. So the eelgrass adds noise, but certainly not this noise. It's not going to add this kind of noise. And this actually looks, that's a 20-centimeter rise over about 100 meters. That looks like a football field, change in the elevation of the football field. So that's not necessarily just a little blip or an error. Those are actual, I think, relatively real changes. Both of these are not little blips. Okay, so we're going to go back and take a look at that when we have some more time. Okay, so there are changes going on. Okay, so now I want to change to the next topic, and that's water levels. We now have some idea what's happening to the Great Bay, and we'll take a look at that, and that'll become important when Salome's doing her modeling, some of the other things that we're interested in the Great Bay. But the other thing is water levels. What contributes to the water levels in the Great Bay? Flooding and inundation is a big deal. And we're now being asked, incidentally, by NOAA through Syracuse to actually develop a flooding and inundation model for the Great Bay, which we're working on. And that includes things like tides, which are regular, predictable oscillations at the mouth. Not so easy once you get further upstream where you have nonlinear shoaling and dissipation by bottom friction. Also, you can predict amplitudes of tides very well, but it's not so easy to predict currents, as most people know. Subtidal flows and oscillations are also prevalent in the area. These are lower frequency than tides. So these are weather-forced oscillations of the sea surface based on larger scale atmospheric disturbances, typically on the continental shelf, let's say. And then finally, they're residual. These are values that are not contributed by the tide or by subtidal. And what we've seen so far is these are relatively small at the moment. And we'll be looking at that later, but I'm not going to talk much about that at the moment, wind and wave setup. Okay, so first, let's talk about the subtidal stuff. And I'll just do this relatively quickly. This is a map of the area. There is weather stations at the Isle of Shoals. Again, this is data that Jim Irish and Larry Ward collected. There's also a weather station here at Hampton. We can compare the barometric pressure across this large distance. And that's a proxy for what's going on in the whole area. In general, we'll see that the atmospheric pressure is not big around the whole area. And I'll show you that in a minute. And then we'll compare the tides at Fort Point with the tides at the Squam-Scott Railroad Bridge. Not the tides. I'm sorry, what am I talking about here? Subtidal. I'll show you the subtidal first. Okay, so the atmospheric pressure. This is the atmospheric time series over about a 40-day period or so, showing the amplitude in pressure head fluctuations. This is inverse barometer effects on the sea surface at the Isle of Shoals and down in Seabrook. And you can see that they match very, very closely. The scales of atmospheric pressure over this part of the world are not very strong. The gradients tend to be relatively small over those distances. Okay, so what's happening out on the continental shelf is happening in the Great Bay and in Hampton all simultaneously. Okay, so now let's look at subtidal amplitudes at Fort Point. These are now at the sea level, and compared to that, the Squam-Scott Railroad Bridge, 26 kilometers upstream as we follow the inlet upstream. And you can see that these oscillations are very strongly correlated. There's a small delay from the mouth to the railroad bridges would be expected, but in general, the amplitudes are about the same. They're not being diminished, and they're not being amplified. They're virtually the same, uniform, over the length of the Great Bay. Okay? And the magnitude ranges about minus 30 centimeters, in this case to plus 50 centimeters. That's almost a meter change in sea level, owing to these slowly varying subtidal oscillations. So this is going to become important if you're interested in navigational kinds of things in shallow water, but also if you're interested in what's happening on the mudflats. 1 meter change in elevation of the mudflats is a huge change in exposed area, also for shear stresses and those kinds of things that you're going to be interested in. So these subtidal changes, although as we'll see will be about a quarter the size of the tides at their maximum, are going to be important at times to the overall dynamics of the Great Bay. Okay, so let's get to the tides then, the regular predicted things. These are observations at Fort Point in 2010, and at the same time, again, at the Squamscott Railroad Bridge. This is a nice way to sort of look at it. It's 26 kilometers inland. And I've removed the subtidal oscillations from these analyses. So we're looking at just the tides and any residual currents that might be there. Typically, those are relatively small. I should also point out that the M2 tidal constituent is the most dominant component. We're in the Gulf of Maine. This is the closest tidal frequency to the residence conditions for the Gulf of Maine. And it has by far the strongest component. I forgot what it was, 95%, 96%?
No, 90.
How much?
M2 is 90%.
90%. You can tell who did that analysis of the energy. 90% of the energy. Okay. And the range is about 2 to 4 meters, typically, over a spring neap tidal cycle. I think most people know that in this area. That's the tidal range at the mouth of the Piscataqua. When you get to the Squamscott Railroad Bridge, the tides aren't that high anymore, are they? They're smaller. In fact, they range about 1.5 to 2.5 meters tide range at this particular time. So there's significant change in the amplitude of the tides from the mouth to, say, 26 kilometers inland. So that's a dissipation in the energy. There's a reduction in the amplitude of that tide, which does not occur for the subtidal motions. Subtidal is not dissipated, is not amplified. In this case, the tides are actually diminished significantly. Okay, so let's take another look at that. So two sets of field observations. The ones that are shown here are the 2007 observations made by Carl and NOAA's NOS. NOS? Yeah, in 2007, which they deployed ADCPs at a variety of places, picked them up and moved them again, I think, for about 2-month intervals. There's chairs over here if you guys want to come in. Yep. And also I'll talk about other observations that NOAA made in 1975, which are summarized by Swift and Brown. Okay, so this analysis and this interpretation of the analysis originally came from Jim. He's had this on the front of his notebook since I've got here. And I just keep looking at this figure right here going, I don't understand this figure. This is the coolest figure I'd seen in a long time. And motivated us to try to generate a model for the Great Bay. We really wanted to be able to repredict this type of behavior. So what is this telling us? What I have is the M2 amplitude in the upper panel, and its phase, the M2 phase relative to Greenwich in the lower panel at Fort Point 0 and then 26 kilometers upstream to the Squamscott. And you can see there's different locations along the estuary as you go. And what we have here are the amplitudes from the ADCP deployments in 2007 and also from the analysis by Swift and Brown of the 1975 NOAA data, which is a little bit shorter record, slightly different characteristics. And then some observations from a variety of sensors that were deployed in the Great Bay and Jackson Lab and other places as other circles and dots and so forth. Now what you find is that the amplitudes in general decay about 29 to 30% between the mouth of the Fort Point and Dover Point. At that point, the amplitudes no longer decay. They're more or less uniform. 11 kilometers upstream to the Squamscott, there's almost no change in the amplitude of the M2 tide. All of the dissipation occurs down the center part of the Piscataqua River right to the General Sullivan Bridge. If you look at the phase, this propagation is consistent with the 28 degrees roughly per hour of the tide propagating upstream. And then once you get to Dover Point, the phases no longer change. That is, the phase of the crest of the tide actually occurs very rapidly at the Squamscott after it hits Dover Point. So there's a big change in the characteristics of what's happening. What did I say? Did I say the Squamscott?
It's Jackson Lab was the break in the slope.
Yeah. Well, it depends on which data point you want to look at. So there's some question as to this data point. Jim and I and Salome have been looking at this for about a week. And we usually spend about 2 hours staring at this figure, trying to understand exactly what's happening. So there's a bunch of things that are going on. One of the things going on, it's about 20 meters water depth all the way up to Jackson Labs down the center of the channel, more or less. There's obstructions. So this is about 20 meters. Once you hit Jackson Labs, it rapidly shallows. So within a couple kilometers, it's only a couple of meters. So there's a rapid change in the elevation of the general Great Bay bathymetry once you get north or south of Jackson Labs. And that certainly has something to do with the characteristics that's happening up here. We need to be able to represent this. If Salome wants her model to work, she has to be able to reproduce this type of behavior at order 1. These are the tides. If you can't get these tides right, you're really not going to do very well in terms of predicting what's happening. Okay. So let's move on. These are elevations. Now let's talk a little bit about currents. And again, there's been a variety of different experiments that have been done over the years to look at the currents. I'm not going to belabor all of those at the moment. But they're all available for the kinds of analyses we want to do, let's say, by verifying models and so forth, understanding what's happening in the Great Bay, spatially and temporally. Okay, so most of these measurements are made with upward-looking ADCPs. This is one of Jim's instruments on one of Carl's frames that he's given us, usually with some type of acoustic release so we can get them back easily. They're weighted heavily. If you don't weight them enough, in certain places they tumble around. As we found out just last year, we had some instruments around where I'm going to show you in just a minute near the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and we didn't put enough weight on it. And it tipped up, and then I went and asked Carl, I go, you guys did this before, how much weight did you put on it? And he said about, I don't know, 4 times as much as we have. In any case, they're very heavy, the currents are strong, and they flip over and so forth. Anyway, lots of stuff being done. And I'm going to talk about some observations, and the first ones are going to be from the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. These are collected at the end of last year. There's some 30-some day deployments. So this is a blow-up of the shipyard here. The main part of the Piscataqua River Channel is here. There's also the shallower Back Bay area, which we also were measuring currents in. And there's an entrance over here that comes out of the Little Harbor place. So this is a very complicated region in terms of the flow patterns. The flow patterns come in here through Little Harbor, up the main channel, and up and around the island itself. And we were there because the Navy was interested in a tidal assessment for renewable energy resources. And so as part of this, we deployed some instruments to see what the strength of the currents were. Okay, so I'm going to show you the results from this location. This is time in days along the horizontal axis, and this is the current magnitude now. This is not telling you which direction the currents are going, they're just magnitude. You'll have to trust me to tell you that these are the ebb flows. So the ebb flows are stronger than the flood tides at this location, and I've plotted all of the depth elevations, by the way. And they range from about 2¼ meters per second, these are 30-minute averages, to about 1½ meters per second from the spring neap tidal cycles. That's probably pretty typical. We're right in the center of the channel. This is roughly in the strongest part of the currents at that location. That's pretty typical of this part of the river itself. That doesn't mean they can't be stronger or weaker in other places, but that's pretty typical. Close to 5-knot currents on average during spring tides, and about 3 to 4-knot currents at other times. This is why the Navy was so interested in the strength of the current. I should point out that that didn't work out so well. Those blue lines outline the federal shipping channel, which makes it extremely difficult to get anything done. Maybe people with ANI skills can help us with that someday. Okay, so we can also show the directions. This is just a current rose plot showing that the ebb flows are typically right down the middle of the channel, pretty much unidirectional. There is some rotation associated with that, and they tend to be a little bit stronger than the flood tides. So the flood tides are going up channel, and there's some rotation and other types of small angular changes that you can have. But generally, the currents are pretty much up and down, pretty regular tidal type currents, not very surprising. Okay, so Jim, watch this next one. So I calculated the mean values. So these are the mean currents averaged over that 30-some day record. And you'll notice that the net current is out the estuary, about 14 centimeters per second. Okay, and there's a little bit of cross-channel flow there. That rotates as you go down into the water column. That is, the surface currents are pointing a little bit towards the south, and the currents at the bottom are actually pointing pretty much due east. That boundary layer type of behavior is common in strong currents like this. And that tells us something about the dissipation, actually, in which we can actually look at. The thing I want to point out is that Jim has showed me some data that he collected, or that he analyzed from Carl's data, that shows that the flow at the bottom of the estuary is actually onshore. The net flow is onshore. And the flow at the surface tends to be offshore. And these are from other locations in the estuary, from 1 and 2 month records. And so we're not seeing any, and we had 2 month-long deployments, and both of them showed all net flow at the surface. So the complications in the estuary are clearly going to be both spatial, depending on where you make your measurements, and the complicated flow around sort of the islands and so forth. But in general, this is the river flow that's coming out of the estuary. If you don't have some net flow integrated in that area, then you've got problems. You're filling up the water. You shouldn't be doing that. Okay. The inflows. All right, let's go now a little bit further upstream. So I'm going to talk about sensors that were deployed in about 10 meters water depth, again in 2007 by NOAA up here at Ferber Strait. And I'm going to show these in a slightly different way, partly because I was too lazy to remake my plots. But so we'll just live with that. Again, there's about a 35 or so day record here. And this is now the currents as a function of water depth. Okay, so 0 is the sea surface mean sea level. And you can see the tidal fluctuations. And in the upper panel, it's the magnitude up to 1.2 meters per second, about 2.5 knots. And the direction is shown in the lower panel, again, as a function of depth. And so the things to notice are these are, again, very strongly tidally modulated, right? Not surprising. These are strong tides in the estuary. That's the dominant motion. And we see very strong rotational changes from 180-degree changes in direction with the tides. You also see the spring tides are bigger than at the deep tidal phases. And they max out at this location at about 1.2 meters per second. That's about half as much as what we saw at the shipyard area. And those are, comparable kinds of comparisons. Had we been further up into the narrow of Ferber Strait where everything's channeling, the currents are a little bit stronger there. But in general, they're a little bit weaker. We saw that there's dissipation to the amplitudes. The tidal currents are also a little bit weaker. Okay, so the tidal currents up at Ferber Strait, 1.2 meters per second. We also know that the amplitudes of the tides are about 4 to 8 times larger typically than the subtidal amplitudes. So what do the subtidal currents look like in the same area? So let's remove the tides from this and get rid of the tides and only then look at the subtidal oscillations. And that's what I'm showing here, again, as a function of depth and time, the magnitude and the directions. But notice what the magnitude of the subtidal current is now. It's no longer 1.2 meters per second, it's 5 centimeters per second. The subtidal currents are very weak. They are not strong. They have really cool and interesting vertical structure, which is kind of an interesting scientific question unto itself, but the magnitudes themselves are really, really small. So we have very large, at times, subtidal oscillations, but they occur so slowly on storm types of timescales that you're not driving a big flow associated with those. Even though we have very interesting rotational structure and so forth, the magnitudes are relatively small. So again, the currents measured by these ADCPs suggest that the tidal flows are probably going to be the smallest. Instead, you can do a residual analysis of these as well. Get rid of the subtidal, get rid of the tidal stuff using a tidal constituent analysis, and you're left with what's called residual currents. They're about the same magnitude as the subtidal flows. So the residual currents, these would be currents that were driven by other processes like winds or waves or some other type of motion, are also relatively small. Okay. Looking for a number. Oh well, we'll just keep going. Okay. So those are currents observed at single locations. That's a difficult thing to use to characterize the flow when you have such strong spatial variability. So what we've been trying to do now over time is measure the spatial variability currents in certain locations at certain times. And we use our wave runner survey system that some of you know, which is called the CBAS, or the Coastal Bathymetry Survey System. And there's an integrated ADCP within the system. So we can transit a particular path in an estuary or river, let's say, a certain number of times. And Lindsay did this as part of her thesis to measure the currents in Hampton Inlet. So we can do this 6 to 10 times, average the currents, and measure what the flow structure looks like at that location. So we're going to look at some examples we made here at Henderson Point right near CV Island. This is interesting because the currents are wildly interesting to us at this point. And this was done again as part of the contract to establish or assess the renewable energy resource in the area. So these are depth average currents along this transect for the ebb tidal and the flood tidal flow at spring tides. And this is one example. This took about 25 minutes to basically transit all this time. So this is a 25-minute average for each of those. And you can see that there are very strong changes as you go from near zero currents at the boundary to very strong, and I can tell you these are over 2 meters per second currents in the center, and then they decay again very strongly towards the middle part of the channel, and then they're very weak and even reverse and go in the opposite direction towards the banks. These are flows coming in here and circulating in funny ways. There's also incidentally flows coming in on this side. And the ebb tidal also shows interesting circulation patterns around the sides. But we can also look at the currents as a function of elevation as well at this particular time. So that's what I'm showing you here for the spring tides on the ebb and flood components. The magnitude of the current is in the upper panels and the direction in the lower panels. And this is depth on the vertical axis down to 20-some meters at the deeper part of the channel. And then this is distance across the inlet itself on the shipyard side and on the New Hampshire side. And so what you have are these really, really strong currents, both in the flood and the ebb tides, upwards of 2 meters per second, very strongly tightly coupled to this 12-meter shelf that was blasted away for the shipping channel several years ago. So these are really strong currents. This is what got everybody so excited about the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. What if we could put a bunch of tidal turbines in here? We have this nice shelf to put everything on. What an awesome place to work. Except it turns out that this is right in the middle of the shipping channel. It blasted this away because of that. And that would take an act of God or Congress to change that law, probably. We're not really sure, but I don't think in my lifetime that's going to happen. So we were going to put an ADCP right there. We abandoned that idea. We just could not get permission to do that in a reasonable way. And the end result would not have been so good. In any case, there's really strong gradients here, from very strong 2 meters per second currents to relatively weak currents headed in the opposite direction. So that shear 2 meters per second change in current over just 100 or 200 meters is a really, really strong gradient. I can tell you that from my work in surf zones. And so the eddies that you see in this area are phenomenally large. You can just see them spinning around in wild ways. So the nonlinear behavior associated with these currents certainly is going to impact the behavior of the tides and may even have some impact on the dissipation of the currents themselves.
Is that differentiated by salinity at all?
We have taken some salinity transects through there, but in general, it's a pretty well-mixed environment. The horizontal components of the mixing are just as strong as the vertical components. And so what we have over here, there might be slight differences, but in general, particularly on the flood tide, it's a pretty uniform distribution of salinity. On some of the strong ebbs, I'm certain there are some variations between these two because it's so much stronger here than it is here. It's likely there's a small change in salinity, but not a huge change. We have some measurements, but we haven't really looked at it closely. Okay, so I want to show one other place, and this is some measurements we did in 2011 at the General Sullivan Bridge. Okay, so we were down here before in a relatively strong, narrow, restricted place by the mouth. Now we're going to come up here to another relatively strong, narrowly constricted current. If anybody's gone over the General Sullivan Bridge and you look out to see the currents going through there, it's phenomenally strong. When you're under the bridge, you almost see a hydraulic jump under there. It is so strong. It is almost like a rapid when you see the water coming through with all the bridge pilings there and so forth. It's impressive. So we went to survey this, and now I don't even remember why. I think we did it also for tidal energy resources for Ken. But we went during the king tide. So the largest tides of the year, we expect to see more or less the strongest currents. And so we're transiting back and forth across here over about a total of 12 to 13 hours. So we did 6 hours in one day and 6 hours the next day. And that's what I'm showing you here. This is time in hours on the horizontal axis. So we're here in the afternoon into the evening doing transects back and forth across this one place. And then we came back in the morning and did the second half. So it's not a continuous tidal cycle, but we're getting a whole tidal cycle over this double day period. And the currents get up to more than 3 meters per second These are averages over about 5 minutes. I think these are 5-minute averages, something like that. And they vary significantly. As I'm showing you all the currents as we propagate across the current. Eventually we get to the sides, and the currents drop off to the point where they're going 1 meter per second in the opposite direction. So there are major eddies that are going on right there at the General Sullivan Bridge. And on the flood tide, that's this one, the negative currents, you also see really, really strong oscillations. And in this case, it's strongly influenced by the presence of the pilings from the bridge itself. I want to show you at this time one example of a half-hour averaged spatial distribution of the current. So on this side we have the western side of the current of the channel, and this side is the eastern side. And it's about 10 meters water depth. Currents here are about 5 knots, 2.5 meters per second, and show very strong lateral gradients going from about 2.5 meters per second to less than 1 meter per second in about 150 meters. So again, you have really strong horizontal gradients in the flow, and that creates a lot of nonlinear behavior in eddies and so forth. The mixing is phenomenally high in these places. And so you can imagine if you're a small little organism like a lobster larva or something, what's going to happen to you when you're in that environment because of all those lateral sort of eddies that we're not really showing here. So the mixing and the changes in those eddies has a lot to do with what happens to the transport. Ultimately, we're going to try to reproduce that type of behavior. That's what one of our goals is. You can also see that there are changes in the direction of the flow. You don't have to get into that too much. Okay, so that tells you something about what's going on in the channels themselves. We're also very interested in what's going on here in the Great Bay. We're interested in understanding the flow structure that actually comes in through those channels, but also what comes up onto the mudflats themselves. This was motivated by work that Megan Wengrove did with Linda and Diana and myself, where she was looking at nutrient fluxes that were driven by shear stresses. She needed to measure the shear stresses to understand how much nutrients are fluxed out of the sediments. And she could do that at individual places, but trying to upscale that, which we were able to do very crudely, but in such a way that we could say that this could potentially be important. We want to see whether that's true. So one way to do that is to try to get up here and try to measure the currents. That's only going to help you in places where you have your instrument. That's also not so easy when the tides are changing from 2 to 4 meter tide range and the mudflats are exposed. So this is where modeling ultimately is going to come into play. And when I get to the modeling aspects of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the data that we collected in comparison to those models at that time. Okay. So we talked about the bathymetry, something about the elevations, and something about the currents. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sediments. So knowledge about the sediments in the Great Bay has gone back some years. Larry Ward has been involved in this stuff for some time. And there was a compilation made, I believe, by USGS and others of the sediments that have been sampled in the Great Bay. And Megan put together a nice plot based on qualitative assessment of what that mud actually looked like. And discretized in terms of mud, sandy mud, and so forth. And use this as a way to estimate sort of the mud fraction in the Great Bay. We've been working on, through funding from the DES and work by Joshua Humberston here in his master's thesis, an objective model based on acoustic backstander to try to estimate in more detail what the sediment characteristics were. I want to talk a little bit about that. Some of the differences between his model and our observations led us to start looking at some geotechnical assessments of the bottom with Nina Stark and her student Greg Luckin from Virginia Tech. Incidentally, Nina will be here next week to give a presentation. I'm not sure what the topic of her talk is yet. She may have given that to us, but she'll be here next week if anybody wants to talk to her. And this is using things called quasi-load-bearing strength, which I am only peripherally knowledgeable about. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the results we got from that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Josh's model to try to do this objective evaluation. This is the bathymetry in the Little Bay, which he surveyed. And then these are the transect lines where we went out and we made sediment sample, superficial sediment sample measurements. So we can compare our backscatter with observations of what's going on in the superficial mud fraction. This was done in 2013. So what he did is an orthogonal decomposition of properties of the waveform. And he defined a number of properties, the maximum, the rise time, and so forth, and then lumped all of those together rather than choose one independently. And then he decomposed that into orthogonal modes, which describe the spatial variation of individual factors with weightings associated with each of those parameters. So each of these different columns are different EOF modes, first, second, and third, ordered by the fraction of variance that's explained by those modes. So it's a way to take all of your data, not choose which parameter you want, and it will essentially give you the weightings based on an orthogonality constraint that most efficiently span the data. So then you can look at the spatial variation, in this case, that which is representing 91 or more % of the variance, and compare that to our observations. It's harder to put physical meaning on some of the higher modes because of those orthogonality constraints. So we're really only interested in those modes that are going to show some relationship to some of our variables. Okay, so you can compare then his amplitude spatial weighting against observations of mud fraction in those particular locations and develop a model with about 65% skill to predict the mud fraction in the area. So we spent a significant amount of time arguing about whether this was a good fit or not. And Josh, of course, was extremely ecstatic by his 45% skill. But eventually we got to the point, by reanalyzing the data and so forth in such a way to get rid of the noise, eventually we got to the point where we could get a reasonable estimate, we thought, of what's going on. And spatially, it's actually quite good. If you look at how to, you can then use that to predict the spatial variation of the mud fraction. And then you can see that looks relatively close to what Megan had shown previously from her analysis of the previously collected sediment data. So you can predict the mud fraction with the principal component decomposition and with about a 65% skill. Okay, so we also wanted to test this model in another place. So we went as close as we could. We went to the Great Bay now from the Little Bay, resurveyed with the sonar under the same and different settings, and then sampled sediments again in this part of the estuary. And what we found was under two lines, when the sonar settings were identical, so we had the same sonar, same settings, it's an uncalibrated sonar. We have the observations in the circles and the spatial variability based on the model with the solid lines for the different transects. And it actually works quite good. The skill is about the same in the Great Bay as it was for the data that we used in the Little Bay. Perhaps not that surprising, considering that these two waters are very adjacent to one another. Although I should mention that the characteristics of the Great Bay are perhaps significantly different than the mudflats in the Little Bay, particularly in the presence of oyster shell debris and eelgrass. Okay, if you don't, I didn't show this, but if you don't use the same settings, not surprisingly, you can't use the model. So the model is completely dependent on the fact that we use the same sonar and the same settings. So it has some limitations, clearly. Okay, but it doesn't always work that well. In fact, there are some places that are systematically different. This is a place by the Bellamy River where our observations were significantly lower in mud fraction than that predicted by the model itself. And so we started looking at this a little bit closer and realized that, based on other people's knowledge of what's going on in sediments, that the bulk density and porosity have a bigger impact on the sonar impedance than the grain size, something that we wanted. We want the mud fraction, but it's really the wet bulk density and the porosity that have a bigger impact. And you can see on the two sides of this estuary, they're significantly different. And we're seeing a significantly different result on one side of the estuary. So this led us to start trying to understand what's going on with the backscatter and the sonar response to the bathymetry, but also the relationship between mud fraction, sediment grain size, and these other properties. So this is where our work with Nina came into play. This is Nina here, where she, and this is Greg Lucking, her student at the time, they came up and started deploying their blue drop penetrometer, which is a geotechnical device that's used to measure load-bearing strength in sediments. And this is a device that Nina developed as part of her PhD program, and now she has, I think she's actually even marketing it. And so when we have enough money, we'd love to get one of these, I think. Anyway, very simple. It's got pressure sensors on them and accelerometers. And you drop it off the side of the vessel, and it has been designed in such a way that it rights itself very rapidly and enters in the sediment at a vertical orientation. And it will do that within a meter of water depth. That's what's special about her instrument relative to a lot of other geotechnical instruments that do this. A lot of times you're standing on the side of the boat trying to push a penetrometer in, but any angle gives you an incorrect number. So you need to be able to, these free fall things need to orient themselves rapidly and enter the sediment quickly. So she came up here, she had not done this before in mud. And so we wanted to know whether these kinds of measurements, which can be made very rapidly, would they be something that could tell us something about the characteristics of the bottom, like bulk density, porosity, something that the acoustics might represent. So we did a number of tests in different parts of the Great and Little Bay, and this was in 2014, so this is a year after Josh had done his work. And I'll just show you some results from an example penetrometer drop. This is now depth into the sediment down to 50 centimeters. And the dashed line here shows the deceleration of the unit itself. So it enters in at a known acceleration, and then it starts to decelerate immediately. And so she has a number of accelerometers that they use in order to measure that deceleration. And then they calculate something called the quasi-static bearing capacity, which is a measure of the ability of a sediment to resist straining due to load bearing. This is used a lot for building and engineering structures in the sediment, and depends a lot on the characteristics of the sediment composition. And so what they've done here is use the maximum load bearing strength, or the quasi-static bearing strength, as a number that they're going to compare to our estimates of properties of the sediment obtained, in this case, only at the surface. So we've gone out and taken sediment cores and sediment samples. We measure the bulk density, we measure the grain size, and they're going to compare it to their observations of load-bearing strength, without really any theoretical guidance as to what's going to happen in muds like this. And what they find is that the quasi-static bearing strength on the left is compared against sand content, medium grain diameter, and dry bulk density. And in general, what it shows is that the quasi-static bearing strength goes up as the fraction of sediment goes up. So when it becomes more sandy or the grain size gets a little bit bigger, then the static bearing capacity goes up. It's more able to resist change. Okay, it's muddy. It's going to be much more easy to penetrate. And there's a little bit stronger relationship, but with fewer data points for the dry bulk density. Again, as the bulk density goes up, the quasi-static bearing strength also goes up. So the question is, how do you separate these three? How do we understand what's happening between any of these particular variables? This is ongoing research, and hopefully we'll be trying to get to some of those answers somewhat soon. Okay, I'm going to summarize this just briefly. Sampling at this point considered only the superficial properties, whereas the penetrometer goes way down into the sediment. It's 50 centimeters. So this is okay for the 200 kilohertz sonar, which is just bouncing off the superficial sediment, but it's not good for the penetrometer. And it's also not good if we're looking at lower frequency sonars, like the 24 kilohertz sonar we'd also like to take a look at, which has much larger volume scattering that moves down into the sediment a little bit further. So theoretical guidance is lacking. We need to go out and make new measurements. And these have to involve sediment cores. So now, instead of just taking the top part of the core, we're going to subsample each layer in the core and get an estimate of the porosity, the grain size, and the bulk density down into the core, and compare that to the pore pressure and quasi-static bearing strength that we're estimating from the penetrometers. Then we want to relate that to acoustic devices, things that are measuring backscatter, so we can try to understand what's happening with the backscatter a little bit more carefully. Okay. So we've gone back 2015. We did a bunch of more penetrometer drops along these 4 transects, and we've collected cores all along this transect again and along this one. We're planning to go back and get more cores along these 2 transects here. So hopefully we can convince Newton to come back and do additional penetrometer studies for that particular thing. When we do these, incidentally, we also take the sonar back out there, so we have sonic measurements as well at the same time. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about. Once we get through the bathymetry changing, sea level changing, currents are changing, and something having to do with the sediment characteristics, we want to start modeling and understanding how the system is changing, how we can make predictions, both in hindcast and in forecast mode, to see if we can understand a little bit more about what's going on. And in particular, I want to talk about some work that Salme did. And this is a presentation, a bunch of these slides she used at the SURF conference in Portland back in November? Yeah, back in late November. So things have progressed a little bit. I'm going to show some of her more recent results too. So a couple things to point out are that her goal in this case was to predict the bed shear stress spatially and temporally only in the Great Bay using some 3-dimensional computer model, and then use those results to see if she can estimate the nutrient loading based on results from Linda's and Vinny's work and Megan's work in the Great Bay. Okay, so she's using this coupled modeling system called COAST. The key element here is that she's using ROMS, the Regional Ocean Modeling System. She's not coupling it now with anything yet. She's not using the sediment transport modules. She's not using the atmospheric modules or the wave modules. The nice thing about this model, ROMS is a very highly used model. It is coupled to these other things. So once we get the hydrodynamics right and the boundary conditions, we'll hopefully be able to move fairly rapidly into atmospheric forcing and sediment transport. In any case, it's a three-dimensional model, hydrostatic, and runs on finite difference approximations. Oops. Key, of course, is the model grid. So she spent a significant amount of time developing a 10 by 10 meter grid based on the 2009 and 2013 Little Bay and Great Bay surveys. And this is her model domain. Notice that she doesn't have the rivers. And she's driving it right here at the General Sullivan Bridge, okay, with tidal constituents based on those from the literature. Okay. So she runs it, and she has a little model here. Okay, so what she's showing here is the currents, and these currents are decimated by a factor of 30. So this is 6 kilometers across here. She's got a data point every 10 meters. So there are 600 vectors here. She's only showing you something like 20 across here. So it's significantly reduced. The colors in the background are magnitude, ranging up to 1.5 meters per second. Remember, the currents that we measured here were about 1.2 meters per second, and a little bit stronger here at the General Sullivan Bridge. But what you can see as the model spins up, you start to get very strong currents on the flood and ebb tide. They're spreading out into the Great Bay. Also notice at low tide, notice how the estuary gets drier. So there's wetting and drying conditions within this model. That's a key element. We can't do anything up here in the Great Bay if we can't deal with the fact that the sediment is being exposed to low tides. So it's got wetting and drying characteristics, and it has this flow coming in and out. Okay, so she's got her model going. How do we know that that's even close to being right? This is the whole basis for us sticking the current meters out into the estuary last year. There's one in particular I want to show you that's right here in the center part of the estuary at about 10 meters water depth. And what I have here now are, this is like, it's about 3 or 4 days tidal cycles from the bottommost sensor all the way to the surface. So again, this is a three-dimensional model. She's measuring predicting the currents at multiple layers. And now she's comparing those to her observations at the currents. Okay, and at first glance, it looks pretty good. She's got the tides pretty good, especially on the flooding currents. Her magnitudes are about right, and her gradients are about right, and they decay at the right rate to the bottom. They're smaller at the bottom than they are at the surface. The ebbing tide, not so good. These kinds of differences in the flow are significant enough that we think we have something to do with this, and this is not surprising considering the simplicity of our model. Okay, but in general, this looks pretty good. That's not bad for a first cut. If you look at the cross-channel velocities, you see very similar types of things. Very good on the flooding component, a little bit less so on the ebbing component. We also want to check another sensor a little bit into more shallow water. Again, here is the north-south component of the velocity, and you see the upper part of the water column, the sensors are coming, the upper bit is coming in and out of the water. So we're only measuring part of the flow, and we're only getting part of the current, right? We're only getting, at low tide, we're not seeing the current anymore. And she's doing a really good job on the north-south component. I looked at this and just thought it was phenomenally good, despite the fact that our phases were adjusted just a little bit to make the tides mess at the forcing condition. East-west component, not quite as good. This started hinting at perhaps we weren't necessarily in the right depth location. And spatially, we might have to go back and make sure that we had the right water depth in those areas. The shallower you get, the more sensitive you are to changes in the bathymetry. This is what led us to wanting to go back immediately and actually start measuring the changes to the bathymetry. So she needs to redo her model, obviously, with the more updated bathymetry from 2015. Okay, well, once you get to that point, we felt like we were at least able to estimate shear stresses in the bay because we thought, well, we're pretty good with the currents. Even if we're not getting everything right, we're not doing too bad. So now she's showing, again, the spin up of the model here as a function of tide phase. Now she's showing bottom shear stress in the color bars. And you'll get maximum values twice on every tide, right? The maximum flood and the maximum ebb and the maximum flood and so forth. So you're seeing just the maximum shear, or the shear stresses here, which are very strong in the center, right, where the currents are the strongest, and a little bit weaker on the mudflats. Okay, so when you exceed a certain threshold, this is where nutrients are believed to be thrown up into the water column, extracted from the sediments. And they only occur in places where you have 50% mud or more. If you're on sediments that are mainly sandy or no sediments, there's no nutrient fluxes there, regardless of what your shear stress is. You have to have those shear stresses in places where there's mud. But we know where there's mud. We have a nice model that predicts where the mud is, so we can use those values, integrate the times when shear stress exceeds those values, and then use the results from the laboratory experiments to estimate what the nutrient flux is for phosphorus in the lower number here and for nitrogen in the upper number. Okay, I want to quickly summarize that here to give you some idea how well she thinks she's done. And I should preface this. Is Megan here? There she is, yeah. So Megan had a really nice paper where she estimated the total load from sediments in the Great Bay. But she had to upscale that in such a way that we really didn't know if that was right or not. Solme's model now predicts the shear stress in places where we couldn't measure it. We have better estimates of where the mud is. And she can then estimate what the total amount of nitrogen and phosphorus per month, per kilogram per month into the estuary. And show that it's at least comparable to what you would get out of the rivers fall, winter, and summer. These are from the literature. A little bit less than what you might get in the spring. Significant amounts of change in the spring. But not to be, it's about at the same rate that Megan had predicted. Oops. Her comparisons are down here. 220 kilograms per event. This is based on the Hurricane Irene. And Solme basically getting average NHEP and spring tidal cycles of about similar kinds of values. So it suggests that, at least at this point, we think that fluxes from the nutrient fluxes from the sediments are likely to be important. I should point out that it's a little less certain with the phosphorus because we're not doing anything chemically with the uptake.
Tom, is this four-wire resuspension of fluid, or is it solid phase resuspension?
It's solid phase resuspension, I believe. Yeah. So the sediments get kicked up into the water column and get dissolved again. So it's all based on sediments being pushed up into the water columns.
Okay, so it's super fine solid.
I think so. Yeah. That's why there's this cutoff. We have a cutoff basically on how much mud is there. This is not a continuous type of model. We're supposed to be out there now doing additional measurements, trying to understand more what the relationship between shear stress, mud fraction, and fluid and nutrient fluxes are at different places in the bay, which will improve our application, let's say, of a predicted shear stress distribution. Okay. Summarizing that, qualitatively, the model flows and problems compare well with the other observations. The bay-wide shear stress predictions are averaged over tidal cycles, and our estimated nutrient flux seems to be consistent with what we estimated for more crude types of analyses. But to suggest that the sediment fluxes should still be considered and require some more, we should be continuing to look at that, which we are. Improvements. I want to take a couple more minutes. We have to extend this grid to the mouth of the Piscataqua. Okay, she's done that already for the 30-meter grid. I'll show you some results for that in a minute. And we're working on the 10-meter, which is difficult, and we need to get stability in the model before we actually get anything. We need to force with observations at Fort Point, including the subtidal. We're now forcing them with tidal constituents at Fort Point, which match what we have at Fort Point. We need to upgrade bathymetry. We're just in the process of finishing that up. And we need to incorporate some other parts to the model, including spatially varying bottom roughness and riverine inputs. Okay, I want to show you some quick results. She just got these, I think, within a week or so. I'd love to show these. This is another thing that we were talking about. This is the bathymetric grid that she's using, which is up to 4 meters above sea level. I don't know whether this is the 10 or 30-meter grid, but the one model results I'm going to show you are from the 30-meter grid. So she's driving everything now out here, and including all of the rivers heading up into this way without any fluxes coming in the river. So we've ignored the fact that there might be fluid coming in. We've just used the bathymetry all the way up the rivers. And what she did was calculate the M2 tidal amplitudes and phases and compared those to the observations from 2007 to 1975 that I showed you previously. So the model predictions are the black triangles overlaid on top of the observations from 2007 and 1975 by Swift and Brown, and the phases in the lower panel. That looks pretty good. I was pretty happy to see that, considering it's a 30-meter grid, very coarse, and we did nothing to the bottom stress. We didn't pay attention to that at all. We just left it at its standard sort of configuration based on a lot of observations in a lot of other environments, including those radically different from ours. Yet we still end up with decay in the amplitude up to Dover Point and then more or less uniform up to the swamps. And so the model is reproducing qualitatively the behavior that we observe on the macro scale. You can look at that a slightly different way by looking at the relative change. So now we've normalized everything by the 4-point data, and now I'm talking about energy, the square and the amplitude. So we're not getting as much dissipation as the observations are showing. The observations are showing about a 50% decay in amplitude. We're seeing about a 35% decay in amplitude. And consequently, we're not getting as much phase change as we move up into the estuary. Things are moving a little bit faster than what would be expected for the types of dissipation that we're observing. So this is a great start. 10-meter grid, that's where that real action is going to happen for us. Okay, so let me just make some conclusions. The bathymetry over the mudflats of the Great Bay is actively evolving over the past 7 years. This has been the first time that we've been able to observe these changes. The channels are oscillating, they're migrating, they're excavating, and they're filling up. And we'll try to quantify that behavior a little bit more as we sort of get to the final ends of our survey. The water level are modulated primarily at tidal frequencies, but the subtidal stuff has order half to a meter amplitude, which is significant when you talk about looking at what's happening on mudflats, or when you're looking at shallow water navigational kinds of issues. The currents are strong. Big news. Over 5 knots in the constrictions, but the subtidal and residual currents are virtually weak, and we can more or less ignore those when we're talking about most of what we're looking at. The currents have high spatial variance, super strong lateral shear, and show high vertical structure. This is going to be difficult to quantify with instrumentation. We're really going to need models to do that, and it's going to have big implications for mixing, sediment transport, and any type of larval dispersal and residence time we want to look at. The acoustic backscatter models for superficial mud fraction have pretty good skill, about 65%, applicable to the Great Bay, but they're complicated by geotechnical problems, understanding the relationship between acoustics and impedance properties of the sediments and how they relate to particular things that we want to know, like mud fraction. So we need these measurements. We're going to do some more work with the over there collaborators at Virginia Tech. And finally, we're starting to model now. Salme's basically doing this. We're getting to this 10-meter established grid, implementing with coast. Incidentally, we're running this on this Trillion supercomputer. Non-trivial to sort of run this over short time frames. The 30-day model runs in 2 days for 30 meters for 30 days. The 10-meter grid's going to take a couple of weeks, probably, at minimum. Significant amount of time, which is non-trivial. And then we have detailed comparisons of observations which we've made, simulate flooding and inundation. This is additional funding we're getting from NOAA and NERS. And then finally, predicting shear stresses. Okay, I think I'll leave you with that. And thank you for spending a little bit more time than you had anticipated. Thank you.
Tom, I have a question from the web. Mimi was wondering if the Great Bay Little Bay bathymetry data is available publicly for voters and such.
2009 and 2013 data, I believe, is available on the web. It's not for navigational purposes, though. I think CCOM's policy is to make sure that those data are not used for navigation. But we give them away freely with that caveat. We have a policy here that we give data away on ellipsoidal heights. And so if they want to convert that to mean sea level, that needs to be done independently. But all the data is freely available, and we will help people understand how to do that. The 2015 data will also be made available as soon as we're finished QCing the data. So John's got about a week more surveying to do. It'll take us another week to sort of QC that. We'll do some comparisons, and then that will be available as well. Yep. So it's just contact me or CCOM. Yeah.
Tom, when you say mud, do you really mean mud? Or do you mean clay? Because there's this cohesion problem with clay, right?
It's clay and silt. It's a combination of clay and silt. No, I've been calling it mud because.
Is there a threshold for clay? Maybe we should use clay, right? forget the silt component, because isn't that the harder thing to overcome is to resuspend the clay?
No idea. 62.5 microns is our cutoff between sediment and sand and non-sand. And I've been calling the non-sandy constituents mud, which is clay and silts. We do not distinguish between those. So that's something to think about. We could actually, we have those measurements. We basically did them in your laser particle analyzer, so we could, in fact, make a greater distinction as maybe a way to maybe estimate more closely what the acoustics is responding to, or maybe something to do with that other properties. I didn't even think about that. I'm not, mud's kind of new for me. I'm stuck in the mud right now. Maybe the clay is the better way to go.
John, that's elegant bathymetry. As you go across further straight with these data, can you see any difference in the area where the presumpscot is exposed along the walls of the channel and the upper part? I mean, the presumpscot's a very different compact glacial.
Haven't even looked at that. That'd be a great thing.
It'd be interesting to see whether in the 6-year difference that you have, whether there's a change in the topography of that particular
Where is it?
marine clay.
Over here somewhere?
Yeah, right in there.
Okay, so I noticed a big change right here in the elevation, and then I went to a closer look at it, and I'm really concerned about the data from 2009. The data from 2015 looks fine, but I'm a little suspect with that. So, in fact, I showed an initial profile here that I was going to show, and then I saw that, and I went, no, not quite ready for that. When I get to that point, I'll come find you. Because I don't know much about that geologic history, but it would be worth sort of seeing if there's anything relative to that geologically.
I think it'd be kind of fun if you had the Grand Canyon to make.
Yeah. There's big changes in some places we're pretty confident about.
The waveform characterization, you're going from very short ranges outwards. Is it being normalized for where it's pulse length limited and beam width limited and sonified areas? It's a big geometry change.
We accounted for the spherical spreading and the losses according to that distance. And then I had Josh compare his results with water depth. We wanted to know whether we were getting simply a range-dependent type of measurement. The problem we have is that in shallower water, it's muddier. And as you go to progressively deeper water, it's progressively sandier. So that, to first order, is just a function of water depth. And that's because the currents are much stronger here, and they're just winnowing away the finer sediments and leaving this gradient that is very similar to the water depth. But once you get to a certain point, the sediment basically doesn't change, but the water depth changes significantly. And so we wanted to know if the backscatter would continue to change as we went into deeper water, even though the sediments haven't changed, and it doesn't. It just levels out. So it doesn't look like we're getting a response that's dependent on the range, the distance from.
Because one of the ways is to actually just anchor the vessel, just leave it there for a tidal cycle. You should get the same solution. If you're not normalizing correctly, if you're only in 2 meters of water and you've got 2 meters of tide.
We'll be doing that. That's a great idea. I hadn't thought about that, and John will be out there sometime. Actually, we won't put it on a boat. We'll put it on something we'll moor it, right? You don't have to be on the boat when that's happening, right? And we could leave it out there for the spring tidal cycle. I didn't even think of that, but that's a great idea. I just had Josh do. Incidentally, we're out there at different levels of the tide at different times. And when I know that there's been times when we've crossed at different times and done cross lines, and those have never showed any dramatic, I would say, differences. And I didn't oversee that sort of analysis, so I can't tell you everything about that, but only the other stuff. We did our best to try to avoid any of those range-dependent kinds of responses. And that was a big concern, considering the mud changes with depth to first order.
Will the 10-meter model even capture the sort of big reverse eddies that occur various places?
Some. Jim would love us to get, every time he comes in and sees soil, he asks her if he's got it down to the 1.5 to 3 meter grid resolution that he feels is necessary to resolve those eddies. Exactly. It's not going to do that for everywhere. There'll be some places we're just not going to be able to resolve those type of motions. There are things that we can do to improve it, though. You can nest your grid, and so you can put nested grids, finer scale inside larger scale grids, to look at specifically at those things. Say you want to look closely at the behavior, let's say, of the eddies around these islands in here, which we know are really strong. You could nest very fine scale grid in here. It's really computationally dependent. we don't want to spend 3 years getting this high resolution model if we can't, it takes so long. The other is that we're implementing other models. And this becomes important. FVCOM, for instance, or ADCIRC. FVCOM comes to mind because it's on an unstructured grid. So you can be very careful about where you have your fine scale versus your not so fine scale. And it is non-hydrostatic. So if eddies are going to become important, the non-hydrostatic components are also going to become important. We can't do that with ROMs. So there's a limit to how fine scale we're going to get before we're going to be missing some physics in the model itself. Now, I doubt we're going to get below about 10 meters. Most models in shallow water, even the unstructured grids, max out at about 10 meters. It's just, it becomes a time problem. I talked to some of my modeling buddies at other places who are real modelers. They're real modelers. They build their models. They're like 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks max for their model. If it's beyond that, it's not worth it. Because they can do, what, 17 runs a year, that's it, in sequence. So the grid resolution will be a problem, but it's certainly something that you strive for. And in this case, we thought, well, we'll start here driving it at the general Sullivan grid. I think there's real problems with that. I think what's happening down there is going to influence what's happening up here, particularly when you start putting in the fresh water flows. And any sort of mixing that comes up here, any water that heads up here is going to end up over here at some point, because it's going to go back into this area and then come back up in here. Anything that gets dumped down there is going to end up out here too. So it's hard to sort of separate this whole thing. You need to model, we think, the whole thing to get it right. All right, thank you.